In the glittering halls of the Grand Aurora Hotel, a radiant bride vanishes from her own wedding, leaving only a crumpled veil and a scream in the night. Was it the nervous groom, haunted by her fortune, the envious sister, cloaked in shadows, the charming best man, hiding debts behind his smile, or the meticulous wedding planner, guarding a locked cellar's secrets? Miss Jane Marple, with her sharp eyes and quiet wisdom, unravels a web of envy and deceit to find the truth before it's too late. Chapter 1. The grand celebration. The Grand Aurora Hotel stood like a beacon of opulence against the soft July sky, its limestone facade glowing in the late afternoon sun. Within its hallowed walls, the ballroom was a vision of splendor. Crystal chandeliers cast delicate rainbows across polished oak floors, and tables draped in white damask bore silver candelabras and roses in full bloom. The air was thick with the scent of perfume and the hum of anticipation. For today was the wedding of Miss Eleanor Langley to Mr. Charles Haverford, a union that had set tongues wagging across the county. Miss Jane Marple, seated unobtrusively in a velvet-upholstered chair near a gilded pillar, observed the scene with her usual quiet acuity. She had been invited as a distant cousin of Eleanor's late mother, a connection so tenuous it surprised her to receive the embossed invitation. Yet, as she adjusted her lace shawl and sipped her tea, her keen eyes missed nothing. Her small, bird-like frame and unassuming demeanor belied a mind as sharp as a freshly honed blade, honed by years of observing the intricacies of human nature. In her village of St. Mary Mead, Eleanor Langley, the bride, was a vision in her ivory lace gown, its train shimmering as she moved through the crowd. Her laughter rang like a silver bell, and her dark eyes sparkled with joy. Was it nervous? Excitement? Miss Marple noted the way Eleanor's fingers fluttered when she greeted guests, as if some unseen worry tugged at her composure. Charles Haverford, the groom, stood tall and handsome in his tailored suit, but his smile seemed strained, and he tugged at his cufflinks with a frequency that suggested unease. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly in her lap, a rhythm as steady as her thoughts. A nervous groom, she mused, is not uncommon, but there is something in his eyes. Nearby, Beatrice Langley, Eleanor's younger sister, glided through the room in a pale green gown that complemented her auburn hair. Yet her smile, though practiced, did not reach her eyes. Miss Marple observed the way Beatrice's gaze lingered on Eleanor, not with sisterly warmth, but with a flicker of something sharper and perhaps. Beatrice's movements were graceful, but there was a tightness in her posture, as if she carried a burden she dared not share. Miss Marple recalled a girl in St. Mary Mead whose jealousy of her sister's engagement had led to a most unfortunate incident involving a misplaced letter. Envy, she thought, is a subtle poison. Roger Thornton, the best man, was a contrast in charm and ease. His laughter boomed across the ballroom as he regaled a group of guests with a witty anecdote. His dark hair was impeccably styled, his evening suit cut to perfection, but Miss Marple's sharp eyes caught the gleam of overly polished cufflinks and the slight fraying at his shirt, collar signs of a man who aspired to a lifestyle just beyond his reach. He hovered near Eleanor often, his compliments lavish, his gaze lingering a touch too long. Charm, Miss Marple noted, can be as dangerous as a blade if wielded with intent. Then there was Miss Clara Vance, the wedding planner, a woman of formidable precision. Her dark hair was pulled into a severe bun, and her clipboard was never far from her side. She moved through the ballroom like a general marshalling troops, adjusting a centerpiece here, directing a waiter there. Her efficiency was admirable. Yet Miss Marple sensed an undercurrent of tension in her clipped responses and the way her eyes darted toward the heavy oak doors leading to the hotel's lower levels. Control, Miss Marple thought, is often a mask for something hidden. The evening progressed with toasts and dances, the orchestra filling the air with strains of Strauss. Eleanor and Charles took to the floor, their movements graceful, but oddly formal, as if they performed for the crowd rather than for each other. Miss Marple's needles paused as she watched Beatrice slip out to the terrace, her green gown catching the moonlight. Moments later, Roger followed, his step casual but purposeful. Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly. "Curious," she murmured, her mind filing away the observation. Then, as the clock struck 9, a scream shattered the revelry. It came from the terrace, sharp and fleeting, swallowed by the night. Guests froze, glasses clinking as they were set down in haste. Charles rushed toward the terrace doors, his face pale, calling Eleanor's name. Miss Marple rose, her shawl slipping to the chair, and joined the throng gathering outside. There, on the stone balustrade, lay Eleanor's veil, its delicate lace, crumpled like a fallen petal. Of the bride herself, there was no sign, the guests whispered, their voices a rising tide of shock and speculation. Charles clutched the veil, his hands trembling. Beatrice stood at the edge of the crowd, her face unreadable. Roger appeared, breathless, claiming he had been in the gardens. Clara Vance, her clipboard abandoned, barked orders to the staff to search the grounds. Miss Marple, standing quietly amid the chaos, looked from the veil to the faces around her. A disappearance, she thought, is never an accident. Someone knows more than they say. As the police were summoned, and the hotel buzzed with activity, Miss Marple returned to her chair, her knitting resumed. Her eyes, bright and unyielding, scanned the room. "Human nature," she said softly to herself, "is the same, whether in a village or a grand hotel, and I shall find the truth, as I always do." Chapter 2. The search begins. The Grand Aurora Hotel. So recently, a Stage 4 celebration had transformed into a scene of disquiet as the clock ticked past 10. The ballroom, once alive with music and laughter, now echoed with the murmurs of anxious guests and the brisk footsteps of the hotel staff. The disappearance of Eleanor Langley, the radiant bride, had cast a pall over the evening, and the air was thick with speculation. Outside, the terrace where her veil had been found lay bathed in moonlight, its stone balustrade gleaming coldly, offering no answers. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her corner with her knitting needles clicking softly, observed the unfolding drama with a calm that belied the sharpness of her mind. Her small, bird-like figure was easily overlooked, but her eyes, bright and piercing, missed nothing. Inspector Ernest Crawley arrived promptly, his broad shoulders filling the doorway as he entered the ballroom. He was a man of methodical habits, with a ruddy face and a mustache that twitched when he was deep in thought. His reputation in the county was one of efficiency, though Miss Marple, who had encountered many such officers in her time, suspected he lacked the imagination to unravel a case as peculiar as this. He was accompanied by 2 constables, their notebooks at the ready, and a young sergeant who seemed more interested in the opulence of the hotel than in the task at hand. The inspector's first act was to cordon off the terrace, barking orders to ensure no one tampered with the scene. The crumpled veil, now in his possession, was placed carefully in an evidence bag, its delicate lace a stark reminder of the missing bride. Miss Marple, sipping a cup of tea brought by a trembling waiter, listened as the inspector began his inquiries. The guests, still clad in their finery, were gathered in the ballroom, their faces a mixture of shock and curiosity. Charles Haverford, the groom, stood near the grand piano, his hands clasped tightly, his face pale. Beatrice Langley, sister, hovered near a window, her green gown catching the light as she stared out into the night. Roger Thornton, the best man, leaned against a pillar, his charm dimmed but his eyes alert. Clara Vance, the wedding planner, moved restlessly, her clipboard abandoned on a table, her usual composure fraying at the edges. Miss Marple's needles clicked rhythmically, a counterpoint to the tension in the room. A disappearance, she thought, is like a puzzle with missing pieces. One must look where others do not. Inspector Crawley began with a general address, his voice firm but not unkind. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "we are dealing with a serious matter. Miss Eleanor Langley has vanished, and we must assume, until evidence suggests otherwise, that foul play may be involved. I ask for your cooperation as we search the hotel and grounds. No one is to leave until we have spoken to each of you." A murmur rippled through the crowd, but no one protested. The inspector's gaze swept the room, lingering briefly on Charles, whose shoulders slumped under the weight of scrutiny. The search began with military precision. Constables fanned out across the hotel, their boots echoing on marble floors. The gardens, illuminated by lanterns, were scoured from the rose beds to the ornamental fountain. The kitchens, still fragrant with the remnants of the wedding feast, were inspected, their ovens and pantries yielding nothing but flour and spices. The upper floors, with their endless corridors and locked suites, were checked methodically, though the staff reported no sign of Eleanor. The cellar, accessible only through a heavy oak door, was noted but not yet opened, as Clara Vance insisted it was used solely for storing the hotel's vintage wines. Miss Marple, overhearing this, raised an eyebrow but said nothing. "A locked door," she mused, "is often more interesting than an open one." As the search continued, Miss Marple slipped quietly into the lounge, a smaller room adjacent to the ballroom where guests had retreated to whisper their theories. Her unassuming presence allowed her to blend into the background, and she listened as fragments of conversation floated past. A matronly woman, in a peacock blue dress, spoke of Charles's financial troubles, her voice low but insistent. "I heard he was quite put out when Eleanor refused to invest her inheritance in his business," she said. A young man, sipping brandy, mentioned seeing Roger near the terrace just before the scream, his tone suggesting more than idle observation. Another guest, a retired colonel, grumbled about Clara's overbearing control of the event, noting her refusal to allow anyone near. The cellar, Beatrice, he added, had seemed off all evening, her smiles forced and her eyes distant. Miss Marple's needles paused as she filed away each snippet, her mind weaving them into a tapestry of possibilities. She recalled a case in St. Mary Mead, where a young woman had vanished during a garden party, only to be found hiding in a neighbor's shed, driven by a lover's quarrel. But this was no simple quarrel, she sensed. Eleanor's disappearance had a deliberateness to it, a calculation that spoke of deeper motives. Money, jealousy, ambition, these were the threads that wove through every human heart, and Miss Marple knew them well. She rose, her shawl draped over her arm, and made her way toward the terrace, where Inspector Crawley was conferring with his sergeant. The terrace was a broad expanse of stone, flanked by manicured hedges and overlooking the darkened gardens. The veil had been found near the balustrade, its lace catching on a rose thorn. Miss Marple, permitted to linger as a harmless old lady, examined the spot with care. The stone was smooth, unmarred by scuffs or scratches, suggesting no struggle. The rose bushes, however, bore a single broken stem, as if someone had brushed past in haste. She bent closer, her eyes catching a faint glint in the moonlight. A single pearl, small and unremarkable, nestled in the soil. It was not from Eleanor's gown, which Miss Marple had noted was adorned with seed pearls in a floral pattern, but it might belong to another. She tucked the pearl into her handkerchief, her expression unchanged. Small things, she thought, often lead to great truths. Returning to the ballroom, she found Charles being questioned by Inspector Crawley. The groom's face was drawn, his eyes red-rimmed. "I was with the guests," he said, his voice hoarse. "We danced, and then Eleanor said she needed air. I thought she'd gone to the terrace, but when I followed, she wasn't there." He clutched his hands together, his knuckles white. "We argued a few days ago about her inheritance. Yes, but I loved her. I'd never harm her." Miss Marple noted the tremor in his voice, the way his eyes flicked toward Beatrice, who stood apart, her face a mask of composure. Love, Miss Marple thought, can be as blinding as hate. Beatrice was next, her interview conducted in a quiet corner of the lounge. She sat stiffly, her hands folded in her lap, her green gown pooling around her like a shadow. "I was in the powder room," she said, her voice steady but her eyes avoiding the inspector's. "I didn't see Eleanor after the toast." A waiter, passing by, hesitated, then spoke up. "I saw Miss Langley, the sister, near the terrace, sir, just before the scream. She was adjusting her shawl, I think." Beatrice's cheeks flushed, but she insisted she had returned to the ballroom immediately. Miss Marple, knitting quietly nearby, noted the faint tremor in Beatrice's fingers. Truth, she thought, is often betrayed by the smallest gestures. Roger Thornton's interview was a study in confidence. He lounged in his chair, his smile easy, though his eyes darted toward the terrace doors. "I was fetching champagne," he said, gesturing airily. "The gardens are lovely at night, so I took a moment to admire them. I heard the scream and ran back." A guest, a sharp-eyed woman in a crimson gown, contradicted him. "I saw Mr. Thornton near the terrace doors, not the gardens, just before it happened," she said. Roger laughed, dismissing her with a wave. "Mistaken, I'm sure," he said, but Miss Marple caught the tightening of his jaw. Charm, she thought, is a fragile shield. Clara Vance, when questioned, was brisk and professional. "I was directing the band," she said, her voice clipped. "The schedule was tight, and I couldn't afford delays." She confirmed the cellar was locked, its key in her possession, to protect the hotel's valuable wine collection. "No one's been down there," she said firmly, but her eyes flickered toward the oak door. Miss Marple, watching from her corner, noted the faint sheen of perspiration on Clara's brow. Secrets, she thought, are heavy burdens. As the night wore on, the search yielded no trace of Eleanor. The guests grew restless, their whispers turning to accusations. Charles paced, his despair palpable. Beatrice retreated to a sofa, her face pale. Roger ordered another brandy, his charm wearing thin. Clara resumed her clipboard, checking lists with a fervor that seemed almost desperate. Miss Marple, her knitting a steady rhythm, pieced together the fragments she had gathered: the pearl, the broken rose stem, the waiter's observation, the contradictions and alibis. "Someone," she thought, "knows where Eleanor is, and I shall find them." She approached Inspector Crawley, her voice soft but firm. "Might I suggest, Inspector, a closer look at the terrace? The rose bushes may tell us more than we think." The inspector, surprised by her forwardness, nodded grudgingly. "We've searched it, Miss Marple, but I suppose another look won't hurt." As they stepped onto the terrace, Miss Marple's eyes scanned the ground, her mind racing. The pearl, the stem, the veil, these were clues, but the true puzzle lay in the hearts of those around her. "Human nature," she murmured, "is the key to every mystery." The night stretched on, the hotel a labyrinth of secrets. Miss Marple returned to her chair, her needles clicking once more. She knew the truth was close, hidden in the shadows of envy, greed, or fear, and she, with her quiet persistence, would bring it to light. Chapter 3. The Groom's Burden. The Grand Aurora Hotel, though still aglow with the trappings of celebration, had taken on an air of unease as the clock neared midnight. The ballroom, now half empty, felt cavernous, its chandeliers casting long shadows that danced across the walls. The guests, once buoyant with champagne and merriment, spoke in hushed tones, their eyes darting toward the terrace doors, as if expecting Eleanor Langley to reappear at any moment. Inspector Crawley's men continued their search, their footsteps echoing through the marble corridors, but the bride remained as elusive as a wisp of fog. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her corner with her knitting untouched for the moment, observed the scene with a quiet intensity. Her small, neat hands rested in her lap, but her mind was a whirl of connections. Each observation, a thread in the intricate web she was weaving. Inspector Crawley, his mustache twitching with impatience, had set up a makeshift command post in the hotel's library, a wood-paneled room lined with leather-bound volumes and heavy drapes. It was here that he summoned Charles Haverford, the groom, for a more thorough questioning. Charles entered, his tailored suit now slightly rumpled, his dark hair disheveled from running his hands through it. His face, handsome but drawn, bore the weight of the night's events, and his eyes, red-rimmed, suggested a man on the brink of despair. Miss Marple, permitted to remain as a concerned relative, sat quietly in a high-backed chair near the fireplace, her presence so unobtrusive that even the inspector seemed to forget she was there. "Mr. Haverford," Inspector Crawley began, his tone measured but firm, "you were the last person seen with Miss Langley before she vanished. I need you to recount your movements precisely." He leaned forward, his notebook open, his pen poised like a judge's gavel. Charles sank into a chair, his hands clasped tightly. "I've told you," he said, his voice low but steady. "We danced the first waltz after the toast. Eleanor was radiant, but she said she felt warm and needed a moment outside. I offered to go with her, but she smiled and said she'd only be a minute. I stayed in the ballroom, talking to Lord Ashby about his horses. Then I heard the scream." His voice faltered, and he looked down at his hands. "I ran to the terrace, but she was gone. Only her veil was there." Miss Marple's eyes, sharp behind her spectacles, noted the way Charles's fingers tightened, the knuckles whitening. She recalled a young man in St. Mary Mead, whose nervous hands had betrayed a lie about a stolen brooch. But Charles's distress seemed genuine, his shoulders slumped as if bearing a physical burden. Yet there was something in his quick glance toward the door, where Beatrice Langley had passed moments earlier, that piqued Miss Marple's curiosity. Grief, she thought, can mask many things, but so can guilt. The inspector pressed on. "You mentioned an argument with Miss Langley a few days ago. Care to elaborate?" Charles's jaw tightened, but he nodded. "It was about her inheritance. Eleanor inherited a fortune from her fatherland, investments, more than most could dream of. She wanted to give a large portion to a children's hospital. I thought it unwise. We're starting a life together, and I suggested we secure our future first at home, perhaps some investments of our own. She disagreed, said it was her duty to help others." He paused, his eyes distant. "It wasn't a serious row. We loved each other. I'd never hurt her." Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly. She had known couples in her village whose disagreements over money had led to bitter words, and sometimes worse. Charles's explanation was plausible, but his tone carried a defensive edge, as if he feared the inspector's judgment or, perhaps, someone else's. She glanced toward the door again, where Beatrice's silhouette had briefly appeared before, vanishing. Money, Miss Marple thought, stirs the heart in ways love cannot always mend. Inspector Crawley scribbled in his notebook, his mustache twitching. "And where were you after she left for the terrace? Can anyone confirm your whereabouts?" "Lord Ashby," Charles said quickly. "And Mrs. Pennington, she joined our conversation about the horses. I didn't leave the ballroom until the scream." He looked up, his eyes pleading. "I swear, I don't know what happened to her." The inspector nodded, though his expression remained skeptical. "We'll speak to Lord Ashby and Mrs. Pennington. For now, stay where we can find you." Charles rose, his movements stiff, and left the library, casting a fleeting glance at Miss Marple as he passed. She met his gaze with a gentle smile, but her mind was racing. A man in love, she thought, or a man in fear. As the door closed behind Charles, Miss Marple rose and approached the inspector, her shawl draped neatly over her arm. "If I may, Inspector," she said, her voice soft but clear, "might I suggest speaking to the staff who served near the terrace? They see more than we think, and their memories are often clearer than those of distracted guests." Inspector Crawley looked at her, his brow furrowing. "Miss Marple, isn't it?" I appreciate your interest, but we're handling this. The staff have been questioned. Indeed, she said, undeterred, but a waiter or maid might recall a detail, a glance, a movement that a guest would miss. In my village, St. Mary Mead, I once solved a theft by asking a gardener about a footprint. No one else noticed. The inspector's mustache twitched again, this time with a hint of amusement. Very well, Miss Marple. I'll have my sergeant speak to the staff again. But don't go playing detective. This is a police matter. Miss Marple inclined her head, her smile serene. Of course, Inspector. I wouldn't dream of interfering. But as she returned to her chair, her mind was already at work. She recalled the pearl she had found near the rose bushes, now safely tucked in her handkerchief. It was not Eleanor's, she was certain, for she had noted the bride's jewelry, a diamond tiara and pearl earrings, but no loose pearls. Could it belong to Beatrice, whose gown had been adorned with a pearl clasp? Or perhaps Clara Vance, whose severe bun might conceal such an ornament? Clues, Miss Marple thought, are like stitches. One must know where to place them. She slipped out of the library and made her way to the ballroom, where the remaining guests were growing restless. Beatrice sat alone on a velvet settee, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her green gown catching the light like a still pond. Miss Marple approached, her manner gentle. "My dear," she said, settling beside her, "this must be a dreadful shock. Were you and Eleanor very close?" Beatrice started, her eyes flickering with surprise. "Oh yes, of course," she said, her voice a touch too quick. "We were sisters, after all. Eleanor was always the bright one, the one everyone loved." A faint bitterness crept into her tone, so subtle it might have gone unnoticed. But Miss Marple's ears were attuned to such nuances. "I'm sure she relied on you," Miss Marple said kindly. "Sisters often share secrets. Did she mention anything troubling her today? A worry, perhaps?" Beatrice's fingers tightened on her clasp, and Miss Marple noted the absence of the pearl she had expected to see. "No," Beatrice said, her voice flat. She was happy. It was her wedding day. She stood abruptly, smoothing her gown. "Excuse me, I need some air." Miss Marple watched her go, her eyes narrowing slightly. A sister's love, she thought, can be a fragile thing when envy takes root. She recalled a case in St. Mary Mead, where a sister's resentment over a shared inheritance had led to a poisoned tea cake. Beatrice's composure was a facade, she was certain, and the missing pearl clasp was a thread worth following as she resumed her knitting. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to Charles's alibi. Lord Ashby, a portly man with a booming voice, was easily found in the lounge, regaling a small group with tales of his stables. Miss Marple approached, her manner deferential. "Lord Ashby, forgive an old woman's curiosity," she said, "but I believe you were speaking with Mr. Haverford before poor Eleanor vanished. Such a charming man, isn't he?" Lord Ashby chuckled, his cheeks ruddy from brandy. "Charming enough, though, a bit preoccupied. We talked horses, my bay mare, in particular. He was there until that awful scream." "And Mrs. Pennington joined you?" Miss Marple asked, her tone light. "Oh yes, halfway through. She's mad for racing, that one." He frowned slightly, though I don't recall Charles leaving until the commotion started. Miss Marple thanked him and moved on, her mind cataloging the details. Charles's alibi held, for now, but the glance he had cast toward Beatrice lingered in her thoughts. Was it fear, guilt, or something else? She made a mental note to observe them together, for relationships often revealed more than words. The night was growing late, and the hotel's grandeur seemed to mock the anxiety within its walls. Miss Marple returned to the library, where Inspector Crawley was reviewing his notes. "Any progress, Inspector?" she asked, her voice mild. He sighed, rubbing his temples. "Nothing yet, Miss Marple. The grounds are clear, the rooms empty. It's as if she vanished into thin air." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly. People rarely vanish, Inspector. They are hidden, or they hide themselves. I wonder, have you considered the cellar? Miss Vance was quite particular about its lock. Crawley's brow furrowed. The cellar. It's just wine, she said. Locked tight. Indeed, Miss Marple said, her tone unchanged. But locks, like hearts, can conceal more than we expect. She left the library, her shawl trailing behind her, her mind already turning to the next thread in the mystery. Charles's burden was clear, but whether it was love, guilt, or greed, only time and her quiet observation would tell. Chapter 4. The Sister's Shadow. The Grand Aurora Hotel, though steeped in elegance, seemed to hold its breath as the night deepened. The ballroom, now nearly deserted, echoed with the faint clink of glasses being cleared by weary staff. The chandeliers, still aglow, cast a cold light over the scene, as if mourning the joy that had fled with Eleanor Langley's disappearance. Outside, the gardens lay silent under a waning moon, their beauty untouched by the turmoil within. Miss Jane Marple, her knitting tucked into her bag, moved quietly through the hotel, her small figure blending into the shadows. Her mind, however, was as bright and sharp as ever, piecing together the fragments of the evening's events with the precision of a seamstress stitching a quilt. Inspector Crawley's investigation had settled into a rhythm of interviews and searches, his constables combing the hotel's sprawling grounds while he questioned the key figures in the library. The guests, confined to the lounge and ballroom, whispered their theories, their voices a low hum of suspicion. Miss Marple, ever unobtrusive, had taken up a seat near a window overlooking the terrace, where the crumpled veil had been found. Her eyes, keen behind her spectacles, followed Beatrice Langley, Eleanor's younger sister, who stood apart from the others, her green gown a stark contrast to the pale curtains framing her silhouette. Beatrice was a study in contrasts, her delicate features, so like Eleanor's, were marred by a tension that seemed to radiate from her. Her auburn hair, caught in a low chignon, gleamed in the lamplight, but her hands, clasped tightly before her, betrayed a restlessness that Miss Marple found telling. She recalled a young woman in St. Mary Mead, whose envy of her sister's engagement had led to a spiteful act of sabotage, a ruined dress, cut 2 ribbons, and a fit of pique. Beatrice's demeanor suggested something deeper, a resentment that had festered over years. Sisters, Miss Marple thought, can be bound by love, or torn by rivalry, and the line between is often thin. Inspector Crawley summoned Beatrice to the library, and Miss Marple, with her usual tact, followed at a discreet distance, her presence excused as that of a concerned relative. The library, with its dark wood and heavy air, felt like a confessional. As Beatrice took her seat across from the inspector, his notebook lay open, his pen scratching as he fixed her with a steady gaze. "Miss Langley," he began, his voice firm but not unkind. "You were seen near the terrace shortly before your sister's disappearance. Can you explain your movements?" Beatrice's eyes, a shade darker than Eleanor's, met his briefly before dropping to her lap. "I was in the powder room," she said, her voice soft but controlled. "I needed to freshen up after the toast. The ballroom was warm, and I felt unwell." She smoothed her gown, a gesture that seemed more nervous than necessary. "I didn't see Eleanor. I returned to the ballroom just before the scream." The inspector leaned forward, his mustache twitching slightly. "A waiter contradicts you, Miss Langley. He saw you near the terrace, adjusting your shawl. Care to clarify?" Beatrice's cheeks flushed, a faint pink that spread to her throat. "He must be mistaken," she said, her voice rising slightly. "I was near the terrace doors briefly, yes, but only to catch some air. I didn't go outside. I went back to the ballroom." Her fingers twisted the fabric of her gown, and Miss Marple, seated quietly in the corner, noted the absence of the pearl clasp she had expected to see on Beatrice's shawl. The pearl she had found near the rose bushes came to mind, its small, unassuming gleam, a potential key to the puzzle. Crawley scribbled in his notebook, his eyes narrowing. "And your relationship with your sister, were you close?" Beatrice hesitated, her lips parting as if to speak, then closing again. "We were sisters," she said at last, her tone carefully neutral. "Eleanor was everyone's favorite. She had a way of drawing people to her. I loved her, of course." The words were correct, but Miss Marple detected a hollowness in them, a note of restraint that spoke of unspoken grievances. She thought of a neighbor in St. Mary Mead, whose quiet resentment of her sister's success had simmered until it spilled over into a public quarrel. "Love," Miss Marple mused, "is often tested by comparison." The inspector pressed further. "Did you notice anything unusual about Eleanor today? Any sign she was distressed?" Beatrice shook her head, her movements quick and precise. She was happy. It was her wedding day. She was glowing, but her eyes flickered, and Miss Marple caught a fleeting shadow of something regret, perhaps, or anger. "I was with the guests, mingling. I didn't see her after the toast." Crawley nodded, though his expression suggested he was not entirely satisfied. "Very well, Miss Langley. Stay close. We may need to speak again." Beatrice rose, her gown rustling as she moved toward the door. Miss Marple's eyes followed her, noting the stiffness in her posture, the way her hand lingered on the doorframe, as if steadying herself. Guilt, Miss Marple thought, or fear. Either way, she knows more than she says. As Beatrice left, Miss Marple approached the inspector, her manner as deferential as ever. "Inspector Crawley," she said, her voice soft, "forgive an old woman's curiosity, but might I ask if you've examined the shawls worn by the ladies tonight? A small detail, perhaps, but in my village, I once found a thief by noticing a missing button." The inspector's brow furrowed, but he humored her. "Shawls, Miss Marple. We're looking for a missing woman, not a fashion report." "Of course," she said, her smile gentle. "But small things, a button, a clasp, can tell us where someone has been. The terrace, for instance, had a rose bush with a broken stem. A shawl caught there might leave a trace." Crawley sighed, but he made a note. "I'll have my men check the guests' belongings. But don't go stirring things up, Miss Marple. This is a police matter." She inclined her head, her expression serene. "Naturally, Inspector. I only wish to help poor Eleanor." But as she returned to her seat, her mind was alight with possibilities. The pearl, the broken stem, Beatrice's evasive were pieces of a larger picture, one that Miss Marple was determined to assemble. She made her way to the lounge, where Beatrice had retreated to a corner, her face pale against the dark upholstery of a sofa. Miss Marple settled nearby, her knitting resumed as a pretext for observation. She watched as Beatrice's eyes darted toward the terrace doors, then away, as if drawn to a memory she could not escape. A young woman, one of the bridesmaids, approached. "Beatrice," her voice low but audible. "Beatrice, you look dreadful. Did you see something out there? You were near the terrace, weren't you?" Beatrice's head snapped up, her eyes sharp. "I told you, I was in the powder room. I didn't see anything." Her tone was curt, and the bridesmaid retreated, her expression puzzled. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, her thoughts racing. A lie, she thought, is like a crack in a vase. It spreads under pressure. She recalled the waiter's testimony, his certainty that Beatrice had been near the terrace. The powder room was on the opposite side of the ballroom, its entrance visible from where Miss Marple had been seated. She had not seen Beatrice enter or leave it during the critical moments before the scream. And then there was the pearl, its smooth surface, a silent witness to someone's presence near the rose bushes. Miss Marple's mind turned to Beatrice's shawl, a delicate silk affair she had worn loosely over her shoulders. Had it caught on the thorns, leaving a pearl behind? Or was it a deliberate act, a clue meant to mislead? She rose, her movements slow and deliberate, and approached a young waiter clearing a table nearby. "My dear boy," she said, her voice warm, "you were serving near the terrace earlier, weren't you? Did you happen to notice Miss Beatrice Langley's shawl? Such a lovely thing, with a pearl clasp, I believe." The waiter, a lanky youth with a nervous smile, nodded. "Yes, ma'am, I saw her adjusting it near the terrace doors. It had a clasp, like you said, but I didn't get a close look. She seemed in a hurry, like she was looking for someone." Miss Marple thanked him, her smile encouraging. "You've been most helpful." She returned to her seat, her mind cataloging the new information. The waiter's account placed Beatrice at the terrace doors, not the powder room, and the missing clasp suggested a connection to the pearl. But why would Beatrice lie? Was she protecting someone, or hiding her own actions? Envy, Miss Marple thought, is a powerful force, but so is fear of discovery. As the night wore on, the hotel's grandeur seemed to mock the anxiety within its walls. Inspector Crawley's men returned from the gardens, their faces grim, reporting no sign of Eleanor. The guests, now weary, began to disperse to their rooms, though none were permitted to leave the hotel. Beatrice remained in the lounge, her eyes fixed on the window, her fingers tracing the edge of her gown. Miss Marple watched her, her knitting a steady rhythm, her thoughts a quiet storm. "Beatrice," she murmured to herself, "carries a shadow, and I shall find what it conceals." Chapter 5. The Best Man's Charm. The Grand Aurora Hotel, though cloaked in the elegance of its chandeliers and marble floors, seemed to pulse with a quiet unease as the early hours of the morning approached. The ballroom, once a stage for celebration, now lay in disarray, with half-empty glasses and scattered rose petals bearing witness to the evening's abrupt end. The guests, confined to the hotel by Inspector Crawley's orders, had retreated to small clusters in the lounge or their rooms, their whispers a low hum of speculation and fear. Outside, the gardens were bathed in the pale glow of dawn, the rose bushes standing sentinel over the terrace where Eleanor Langley's veil had been found. Miss Jane Marple, her knitting bag at her side, moved through the hotel with the quiet grace of a shadow, her eyes sharp and her mind sharper still. She had seen many a mystery in her time, and this one, with its tangled web of motives, was proving as intricate as any she had encountered in St. Mary Mead. Inspector Crawley, his face etched with fatigue, had returned to the library to continue his interviews. His notebook was filled with scrawled observations, but the absence of Eleanor Langley remained a gaping void at the heart of his investigation. Miss Marple, permitted to linger as a harmless observer, took her usual seat in a corner, her small figure dwarfed by the high-backed chair. Her needles lay idle for the moment, her attention fixed on Roger Thornton, the best man, who was now summoned before the inspector. Roger entered with a swagger that seemed only slightly dimmed by the night's events, his dark hair still impeccably styled, his evening suit bearing the faintest crease from hours of wear. His smile, broad and disarming, was a weapon he wielded with ease, but Miss Marple's keen eyes noted the tension in his jaw, the slight flicker of his gaze toward the door. "Mr. Thornton," Inspector Crawley began, his voice heavy with the weight of the hour, "you were seen near the terrace doors just before Miss Langley's disappearance. I need a clear account of your movements." Roger leaned back in his chair, his posture relaxed but his eyes alert. "I've told you, Inspector," he said, his voice smooth as polished wood. "I was fetching a bottle of champagne from the bar. The guests were clamoring for more, and I thought I'd lend a hand. I stepped out to the terrace for a moment. Lovely night. You know, those gardens are quite something in the moonlight. Then I heard the scream and ran back." He spread his hands, his smile widening. Nothing more to it. The inspector's mustache twitched, a sign of his growing impatience. "I guessed Mrs. Hargrove, I believe, says she saw you lingering near the terrace doors, not outside in the gardens. She's quite certain." Roger's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, but he recovered quickly, letting out a soft chuckle. Mrs. Hargrove must have her wires crossed. She's a dear woman, but the champagne was flowing freely. I was outside, admiring the view. Ask the barman, he'll tell you. I was at the bar just before. Miss Marple, her hands folded neatly in her lap, observed the exchange with quiet intensity. Roger's charm was undeniable, a polished veneer that had likely opened many doors. But she had known men like him in St. Mary Mead, men whose easy smiles hid debts, dalliances, or darker secrets. She noted the gleam of his cufflinks, gold and ostentatious, and the slight wear at the cuffs of his shirt, a contrast that suggested a man living beyond his means. Charm, she thought, is a currency, but it often runs out when pressed. Crawley scribbled in his notebook, his eyes narrowing. In your relationship with Miss Langley, you seemed quite attentive to her during the evening. Roger's laugh was light, almost musical. Eleanor, she's a gem, Inspector. Charles is a lucky man. I was just playing my part as best man, keeping the bride smiling, making sure the day went smoothly. No more, no less. His fingers brushed his cufflinks, a gesture so casual it might have gone unnoticed. But Miss Marple's eyes caught the slight tremor in his hand. Nerves, she thought, or something to hide. The inspector leaned forward, his voice hardening. There's talk, Mr. Thornton, that you've been in financial straits. A man in debt might see a wealthy bride as an opportunity. Care to comment? Roger's smile tightened, but he maintained his composure. Gossip, Inspector. I enjoy a good wager now and then, but I'm hardly destitute. My tailoring bills might suggest otherwise, but I manage. He laughed again, though it rang hollow. Surely you don't think I'd kidnap a bride over a few unpaid bills? Crawley's pen paused, his gaze steady. I'm not ruling anything out, Mr. Thornton. Stay where we can find you. Roger rose, his movements fluid, and offered a mock salute before leaving the library. Miss Marple watched him go, her mind cataloging his words, his gestures, the faint sheen of perspiration on his brow. A man like that, she thought, lives for appearances. But appearances can crumble under scrutiny. She rose, her shawl draped over her arm, and approached the inspector with her usual deference. Inspector Crawley, she said, her voice soft as a breeze. Forgive an old woman's meddling, but might I suggest speaking to the barman Mr. Thornton mentioned? His account could clarify things, and in my experience, those who serve drinks see more than we expect. Crawley sighed, but his expression softened slightly. You're persistent, Miss Marple. Very well, I'll have my sergeant check with the barman, but let's keep this orderly, shall we? Of course, she said, her smile serene. I only wish to see poor Eleanor found. But as she returned to her seat, her thoughts were far from idle. Roger's alibi hinged on the barman, but his presence near the terrace doors, as Mrs. Hargrove had noted, suggested a discrepancy. And then there was the matter of his cufflinks, expensive, yet his shirt showed signs of wear. Had he been close enough to the rose bushes to leave a trace? The pearl she had found, tucked safely in her handkerchief, came to mind, though she doubted it belonged to Roger. Still, his charm was a mask, and Miss Marple was determined to see what lay beneath. She made her way to the lounge, where Roger had joined a small group of guests, his laughter ringing out as he recounted a story about a horse race. His ease was almost convincing, but Miss Marple noted the way his eyes darted toward the terrace, as if drawn to the scene of the crime. She settled nearby, her knitting resumed as a pretext for observation, and listened as a young woman in a sapphire gown leaned toward Roger. You were awfully attentive to Eleanor, she said, her tone teasing but pointed. Almost made Charles jealous, I'd wager. Roger's smile was dazzling. Nonsense, my dear. A best man's job is to keep the bride happy. Charles knows I'm no threat. But his hand tightened around his glass, and Miss Marple's keen eyes caught the fleeting shadow that crossed his face. A threat, she thought, or a man with a plan. She recalled a case in St. Mary Mead, where a charming young man had swindled a widow with promises of investment, his smile as much a tool as his ledger. Roger's demeanor was similar, calculated, polished, but fragile under pressure. She made a mental note to inquire about his financial situation, perhaps through the hotel staff, who often overheard more than they let on. A waiter, passing by, caught her eye, and she beckoned him with a gentle smile. "My dear," she said, "you were serving near the bar earlier, weren't you? Did you see Mr. Thornton fetching champagne?" as he said. The waiter, a wiry man with a quick nod, frowned slightly. "Mr. Thornton. He was at the bar, yes, but only for a moment. He took a bottle and headed toward the terrace doors, not the gardens. I thought he was bringing it to someone." He hesitated, then added, "He seemed in a rush." "Ma'am?" Miss Marple thanked him, her mind racing. Roger's story was unraveling, the barman's account placing him closer to the terrace than he admitted. Had he seen Eleanor, or followed her? The broken rose stem, the pearl, the scream, these were pieces of a puzzle, and Roger's charm was but one part of it. She glanced at him again, now laughing with a group of men, his confidence restored. A man like that, she thought, thinks he can outrun suspicion, but suspicion, like truth, has a way of catching up. As dawn crept over the horizon, the hotel's grandeur seemed to fade, its opulence no match for the mystery within. Inspector Crawley's men returned from another sweep of the grounds, their faces grim. Eleanor was still missing, and the weight of her absence pressed on everyone. Miss Marple, her knitting a steady rhythm, watched Roger from across the room, her thoughts a quiet storm. "Charm," she murmured to herself, "is a dangerous thing when it hides a lie." She would watch him closely, for the truth, she knew, was never far from those who smiled too brightly. Chapter 6. The Planner's Precision. The Grand Aurora Hotel. Its grandeur, now muted by the gray light of dawn, stood as a silent witness to the unresolved mystery of Eleanor Langley's disappearance. The ballroom, once vibrant with music and laughter, was now a hollow shell, its tables cluttered with abandoned glasses and wilting flowers. The guests, weary from a sleepless night, had dispersed to their rooms or lingered in the lounge, their faces etched with unease. Inspector Crawley's men moved through the hotel with dogged determination, their searches yielding nothing but frustration. Miss Jane Marple, her knitting bag tucked beside her, sat in a quiet corner of the lounge, her small frame dwarfed by the opulent surroundings. Her eyes, sharp and unyielding, scanned the room, her mind weaving together the threads of suspicion that had emerged through the night. Inspector Crawley, his face lined with fatigue, had returned to the library to continue his interviews. The heavy oak door, the scent of old leather, and the faint creak of the floorboards created an atmosphere of solemnity, as if the room itself demanded truth. Miss Marple, permitted to remain as a concerned observer, settled into her usual chair, her presence so unobtrusive that she seemed part of the furniture. Her needles lay idle, her attention fixed on Clara Vance, the wedding planner, who now entered the library with a brisk step. Clara was a woman of meticulous precision, her dark hair pulled into a severe bun, her tailored black dress immaculate despite the late hour. Her clipboard, her constant companion throughout the evening, was conspicuously absent, and Miss Marple noted the faint tremor in her hands as she sat across from the inspector. "Miss Vance," Crawley began, his voice heavy but steady, "you've been described as the linchpin of this wedding, overseeing every detail. I need a clear account of your movements last night, particularly around the time Miss Langley vanished." Clara's posture was rigid, her eyes meeting the inspector's with a cool determination. "I was directing the band," she said, her voice clipped and professional. The schedule was tight: speeches, toasts, the first dance. I was in the ballroom, ensuring everything ran smoothly. I didn't leave until after the scream, when I went to the terrace with the others." Her fingers brushed the edge of her sleeve, a small gesture that might have gone unnoticed, but Miss Marple's keen eyes caught the nervous twitch. Crawley's mustache twitched, a sign of his growing scrutiny. "You were quite particular about the cellar being locked, Miss Vance. Why was that?" Clara's expression remained composed, but her eyes flickered briefly toward the door. "The hotel stores its vintage wines there," she said. "They're valuable, some bottles worth hundreds. It's standard procedure to keep the cellar locked during events to prevent theft or tampering. I have the only key." She patted her pocket, as if to confirm its presence, but Miss Marple noted the slight hesitation in the gesture, as if Clara were reassuring herself as much as the inspector, and no one accessed the cellar during the evening. Crawley pressed, his pen poised over his notebook. "No one," Clara said firmly. "I checked the lock myself before the reception began. It was secure." Her voice was steady, but Miss Marple detected a faint strain, a note of defensiveness that suggested more than professional diligence. She recalled a case in St. Mary Mead, where a shopkeeper's insistence on a locked storeroom had concealed a stolen crate of silver. Precision, Miss Marple thought, can be a shield, but it often hides a crack. The inspector leaned forward, his gaze piercing. "A guest mentioned seeing you near the oak door leading to the cellar earlier in the evening, before the toast. Care to explain?" Clara's lips tightened, but she maintained her composure. "I was checking the door, as I said. It's part of my duties to ensure everything is secure. I returned to the ballroom immediately after." She folded her hands in her lap, her knuckles pale. "I had no reason to go near the terrace, or anywhere else." Crawley scribbled in his notebook, his expression skeptical. "And your relationship with Miss Langley? Any disagreements over the wedding plans?" Clara's eyes narrowed slightly, but her voice remained even. Eleanor was a dream client, decisive, clear about what she wanted. "We worked well together. I had no reason to wish her harm." Her words were measured, but Miss Marple caught the faintest pause before harm, as if Clara had chosen the word with care. Control, Miss Marple thought, is a powerful motive, but so is fear of losing it. The inspector nodded, though his eyes suggested he was not fully convinced. "Very well, Miss Vance. Stay where we can reach you." Clara rose, her movements precise, and left the library with a nod. Miss Marple watched her go, noting the way her hand lingered on the doorframe, as if reluctant to leave the safety of the room. A woman like that, she thought, builds her world on order, but disorder reveals the truth. Miss Marple rose, her shawl draped neatly over her arm, and approached the inspector with her characteristic deference. "Inspector Crawley," she said, her voice soft as a whisper, "forgive an old woman's curiosity, but might I suggest examining the cellar door itself? A lock can tell a story scratches, where, perhaps a sign of tampering." Crawley's brow furrowed, but he was growing accustomed to her gentle prodding. "The cellar, again. You're quite fixated on it, Miss Marple. We'll check it, but Miss Vance's story holds for now." "Of course," Miss Marple said, her smile serene. "I only thought a lock might reveal more than a key." She returned to her seat, her mind alight with possibilities. Clara's insistence on the cellars. Security was logical, but her nervousness suggested something unspoken. The oak door, heavy and unyielding, had drawn Miss Marple's attention earlier, when she had noticed a faint scratch near the lock, a fresh mark, not yet dulled by time. It was a small detail, but in her experience, small details were the threads that unraveled mysteries. She made her way to the lounge, where Clara had resumed her duties, albeit without her clipboard. She was speaking to a waiter, her voice low but sharp, instructing him to clear the remaining tables. Miss Marple settled nearby, her knitting resumed as a pretext for observation. Clara's movements were efficient, but there was a brittleness to them, as if she were holding herself together by sheer will. A young woman, one of the bridesmaids, approached Clara, her voice hesitant. "Miss Vance, you were so particular about the cellar. Is there something valuable down there, besides wine?" Clara's head snapped up, her eyes sharp. "Just wine," she said, her tone curt. "It's my job to protect the hotel's assets. Now, please, I have work to do." The bridesmaid retreated, her expression puzzled, and Miss Marple's needles paused, a sharp response, she thought, for a simple question. She recalled a case in St. Mary Mead, where a housekeeper's obsession with a locked pantry had concealed a stash of stolen goods. Clara's control over the wedding was absolute, but her defensiveness about the cellar suggested a secret beyond vintage bottles. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the scratch on the lock, the key Clara claimed to possess. Had someone tampered with it, or was Clara's story a carefully constructed facade? The pearl, the broken rose stem, the scream, these were clues. But the cellar was a shadow in the background, waiting to be illuminated. She approached a young maid, who was polishing a silver tray nearby. "My dear," Miss Marple said, her voice warm and encouraging, "you must see so much, working in such a grand hotel. Tell me, have you noticed anyone near the cellar door this evening? It's such a sturdy thing, isn't it?" The maid, a slight girl with wide eyes, hesitated, then nodded. "I saw Miss Vance there, ma'am, before the dancing started. She was checking the lock, like she always does. But later, after the scream, I saw her near it again, looking worried, like she didn't see me though." The girl blushed, as if afraid she'd said too much. Miss Marple smiled, patting her hand. "You're a sharp girl, thank you." She returned to her seat, her mind racing. Clara's presence at the cellar door after the scream was a new piece of the puzzle, one that contradicted her claim of staying in the ballroom. Had she gone to check the lock or to ensure something remained hidden? The scratch, the key, Clara's nervousness, these were threads, and Miss Marple was determined to follow them. As the dawn light crept through the windows, the hotel's opulence seemed to fade, its beauty no match for the mystery within. Inspector Crawley's men returned from another fruitless search, their faces grim. Eleanor was still missing, and the weight of her absence pressed on everyone. Miss Marple, her knitting a steady rhythm, watched Clara from across the room, her thoughts a quiet storm. "Precision," she murmured to herself, "is a virtue, but it can also be a cage, and I shall find what it holds." Chapter 7. A clue in the Vale de Grand Aurora Hotel. Its opulence, now softened by the pale light of early morning, stood as a weary sentinel over the unresolved mystery of Eleanor Langley's disappearance. The ballroom, once a stage for joy, was now a silent witness to the night's turmoil. Its scattered chairs and wilting roses, a stark contrast to the revelry of hours past. The guests, confined to the hotel by Inspector Crawley's orders, had mostly retired to their rooms, leaving the lounge and corridors quiet, save for the occasional murmur of staff or the tread of a constable's boots. Miss Jane Marple, her knitting bag at her side, sat in a cushioned armchair near a window, her small frame bathed in the soft glow of dawn. Her eyes, bright and unyielding behind her spectacles, were fixed on the terrace beyond, where the crumpled veil had been found, a single, poignant clue in a puzzle that grew more intricate with each passing hour. Inspector Crawley, his face etched with the strain of a sleepless night, had returned to the library, his makeshift headquarters, where he pored over his notes with dogged determination. The investigation had stalled, the searches of the hotel and grounds yielding no trace of Eleanor. The veil, now in an evidence bag on the library table, was the sole tangible link to the missing bride, and Crawley had ordered it examined closely. Miss Marple, permitted to linger as a concerned relative, had followed him to the library, her presence as unobtrusive as ever. She settled into her usual corner, her knitting untouched, her attention drawn to the veil, as Crawley and his sergeant discussed its significance. "It's just lace," the sergeant said, his voice tinged with frustration. No blood, no tears, nothing to tell us where she went. Crawley's mustache twitched, a sign of his growing irritation. It was found on the terrace, near the rose bushes. Someone left it there deliberately or not. We need to know who and why. Miss Marple, her hands folded neatly in her lap, leaned forward slightly. If I may, Inspector, she said, her voice soft but clear, might I take a closer look at the veil? In my village, St. Mary Mead, I once found a clue in a piece of fabrica thread that led to a thief. Small things can be most revealing. Crawley brow furrowed, but he was growing accustomed to her gentle persistence. Very well, Miss Marple, he said, sliding the evidence bag toward her, but handle it carefully. It's evidence. She nodded, her smile serene, and took the bag, with delicate hands. The veil, a delicate confection of ivory lace, was crumpled but intact, its edges adorned with tiny seed pearls. Miss Marple's keen eyes scanned it, noting the faint snag where it had caught on the rosebush, the petals still clinging to the fabric. But it was another detail that caught her attention, a smudge of rouge, faint but unmistakable, on the inner layer of the lace. It was not Eleanor's shade. She had worn a soft pink, barely noticeable, as Miss Marple had observed during the reception. This rouge was a vivid coral, bold and striking. Her mind flickered to Beatrice Langley, who had been seen in the powder room applying a similar shade before the toast. A clue, Miss Marple thought, is like a footprint in the snow. It tells us where someone has been. She returned the veil to Crawley, her expression unchanged. A curious mark, Inspector, she said. That rougette's not the bride's, I think. You might ask the ladies about their cosmetics. Such things can be telling. Crawley's eyes narrowed, but he made a note. Rouge, you say? We'll look into it. Anything else, Miss Marple? She hesitated, then added, the snag on the veil suggests it was caught, perhaps in haste. The rose bushes on the terrace are thorny. Might there'd be a thread or another trace there. She paused, her tone gentle. In my experience, nature often holds secrets we overlook. The inspector sighed, but he nodded. We've searched the terrace, but I'll have my men check the bushes again. You're a sharp one, Miss Marple, I'll give you that. He turned to his sergeant, issuing orders to re-examine the terrace, while Miss Marple returned to her seat, her mind racing. The rouge was a link to Beatrice, but it raised questions. Had Beatrice handled the veil, perhaps in a moment of anger or desperation? Or was it a deliberate plant, meant to mislead? The pearl she had found near the bushes, tucked safely in her handkerchief, came to mind again. Its significance, still unclear. Determined to explore further, Miss Marple left the library and made her way to the terrace, where the morning light cast long shadows across the stone balustrade. The rose bushes, their blooms heavy with dew, stood as silent witnesses to the night's events. She bent low, her eyes scanning the ground where the veil had been found. The broken stem she had noticed earlier was still there, its jagged edge suggesting a hurried passage. Nearby, in the soft earth, she spotted a faint imprint, not a footprint, but a scuff, as if someone had stumbled or turned quickly. She straightened, her thoughts turning to the hotel's layout. The terrace led to the gardens, but also to a side path that wound toward the service entrance end. She recalled the heavy oak door to the cellar, so fiercely guarded by Clara Vance, loomed in her mind. The scratch on the lock, the maid's account of Clara's worry after the scream, these were threads that pointed to a hidden truth. But the veil, with its coral rouge, suggested Beatrice's involvement, or at least her presence. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to a case in St. Mary Mead, where a stolen necklace had been found in a garden, its clasp snagged on a shrub. The thief had been a jealous friend, her envy masked by smiles. Envy, Miss Marple thought, is a fire that burns slowly, but it leaves marks. She returned to the lounge, where Beatrice sat alone, her green gown pooling around her like a shadow. Miss Marple approached, her manner kind but probing. "My dear," she said, settling beside her, "you must be dreadfully worried about Eleanor. I noticed your lovely rouge earlier, such a striking shade. Did you happen to touch her veil during the evening? It's such a delicate thing, easily marked." Beatrice's eyes widened, a flicker of alarm crossing her face before she masked it with a smile. "Her veil? No, I didn't touch it. I was in the powder room, as I told the inspector." Her fingers brushed her cheek, where the coral rouge still lingered, and Miss Marple noted the gesture, so like Clara's nervous twitch. "I don't wear much makeup," Beatrice added, her voice a touch too quick. "It must be someone else's." Miss Marple nodded, her smile gentle. "Of course, my dear. These things can be confusing." But her mind was cataloging the lie. Beatrice's rouge matched the smudge, and her denial was too swift, too practiced. She recalled the waiter's testimony, placing Beatrice near the terrace, and the missing pearl clasp from her shawl. The pieces were aligning, but the picture was not yet clear. She rose, intending to speak to the maid who had seen Clara near the cellar, when a young constable approached, his face flushed with excitement. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice low, "the inspector sent me to find you. We found something on the Teresa hairpin, caught in the rose bushes. It's silver, with a small pearl, like the ones Miss Beatrice wears in her hair." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled, though her expression remained serene. "How very interesting," she said. "Might I see it, if the inspector permits?" The constable nodded, leading her to the library, where Crawley was examining the hairpin, under a lamp. It was indeed silver, its pearl matching the one Miss Marple had found, though its significance was still a mystery. A hairpin, she thought, is a small thing, but it places someone where they claimed not to be. "Miss Marple," Crawley said, his tone grudgingly respectful, "you were right about the terrace. This hairpin changes things. It's Beatrice Langley's, no doubt, matches the one she wore tonight. She said she wasn't outside, but this suggests otherwise." Miss Marple nodded, her mind racing. "Indeed, Inspector. And the rouge on the veil might. You compare it to Miss Beatrice's cosmetics. In my village, a smudge of paint once led to a burglar. Small things, you see, tell large stories." Crawley's mustache twitched, but he nodded. "We'll do it. You've a knack for this, Miss Marple." He turned to his sergeant, issuing orders to collect Beatrice's makeup, while Miss Marple returned to her seat, her thoughts a quiet storm. The veil, the rouge, the hairpin, the pearl, these were clues, and they pointed to Beatrice, but the cellar loomed in the background, its locked door a silent challenge. "Truth," Miss Marple murmured, "is like lace, delicate, but strong enough to hold a mystery together." Chapter 8. The Hidden Cellar, the Grand Aurora Hotel. Its elegance, now softened by the full light of morning, seemed to sag under the weight of the unresolved mystery. The ballroom, stripped of its festive glow, lay quiet, its scattered chairs and wilted flowers a testament to the night's upheaval. The guests, confined to the hotel by Inspector Crawley's orders, moved listlessly through the lounge, or remained in their rooms, their whispers of speculation now dulled by exhaustion. Outside, the gardens shimmered with dew, the terrace a silent stage where Eleanor Langley's veil had been found, its lace and rouge a haunting clue. Miss Jane Marple, her knitting bag at her side, sat in a corner of the lounge, her small figure bathed in sunlight filtering through the tall windows. Her eyes, sharp and unyielding, were fixed on the unfolding drama, her mind weaving together the threads of evidence with the precision of a master weaver. Inspector Crawley, his face etched with the strain of a sleepless night, had returned to the library, his notebook now a thick palimpsest of scrawled observations. The investigation had reached a critical juncture, with the hairpin and the rouge-stained veil pointing to Beatrice Langley, yet no trace of Eleanor had been found. Miss Marple, permitted to linger as a concerned relative, had followed the inspector to the library, her presence as unobtrusive as a shadow. Her knitting lay untouched, her attention drawn to the faint scratch on the cellar door lock, a detail she had noted earlier and mentioned to Crawley. The cellar, guarded so fiercely by Clara Vance, had become a focal point in her thoughts. Its locked door a silent challenge to the truth. "Inspector," Miss Marple said, her voice soft but firm as she approached Crawley, "I wonder if we might examine the cellar more closely. That scratch on the locket's fresh, you know, and in my village, St. Mary Mead. A scratched lock once led me to a hidden cache of stolen goods. Small marks can hide large secrets." Crawley's mustache twitched, his fatigue tempered by a grudging respect for her persistence. "You're like a terrier with a bone, Miss Marple," he said, rubbing his temples. "Miss Vance insists the cellar's just for wine, but we'll check it. Can't hurt, I suppose." He turned to his sergeant, a lanky young man with a notebook, and issued orders to fetch Clara and her key. "But if this is a wild goose chase, I'll not be pleased." Miss Marple inclined her head, her smile serene. "Of course, Inspector, I only wish to see poor Eleanor found." But her mind was alight with possibilities. The rouge on the veil, the hairpin, the pearl, the broken rose stem, these clues pointed to Beatrice, but the cellar, with its scratched lock and Clara's defensiveness, suggested a deeper layer to the mystery. She recalled a case in St. Mary Mead, where a locked shed had concealed a runaway girl, her disappearance orchestrated to deflect suspicion. Secrets, she thought, are often locked away, but locks can be opened. Clara Vance arrived, her severe bun as impeccable as ever, though her eyes betrayed a flicker of unease. She clutched the cellar key, a heavy brass affair, and handed it to Crawley, with a curt nod. "As I've said, Inspector, it's just wine down there," she said, her voice clipped. "But if you must look, I'll open it myself." Her fingers lingered on the key, as if reluctant to relinquish control, and Miss Marple noted the slight tremor in her hand. Control, she thought, is a fragile thing when secrets are at stake. The small group, Crawley, his sergeant, Clara, and Miss Marple, made their way to the oak door at the end of a dim corridor, its heavy panels carved with vines. The scratch on the lock was indeed fresh, a thin silver line glinting in the lamplight. Clara inserted the key, her movements precise but tense, and the lock clicked open with a reluctant groan. The door swung inward, revealing a narrow staircase descending into darkness, the air cool and heavy with the scent of damp stone and oak casks. Crawley's sergeant lit a lantern, its glow casting eerie shadows as they descended. The cellar was vast, its stone walls lined with racks of dusty bottles, their labels faded but valuable. Barrels stood in neat rows, and the air was thick with the musty aroma of aged wine. Crawley's men moved methodically, checking behind casks and tapping walls for hollow spaces. Clara hovered near the entrance, her eyes darting nervously, while Miss Marple, her shawl drawn close, observed the scene with quiet intensity. Her eyes scanned the shadows, searching for anything out of place. A cellar, she thought, is a place for hiding more than wine. As the search continued, Miss Marple's gaze fell on a stack of crates in a far corner, their placement slightly askew, as if moved in haste. She approached, her steps slow but deliberate, and noticed a faint scuff mark on the stone floor, leading to a narrow gap behind the crates. "Inspector," she said, her voice calm but insistent, "might we look here? These crates seem out of place." Crawley, his patience wearing thin, nodded to his sergeant, who began shifting the crates with a grunt. Behind them, set into the stone wall, was a low door, its edges nearly invisible in the dim light. The lock was new, its brass gleaming, and bore a faint scratch, similar to the one on the main cellar door. Clara's face paled, her hands clenching at her sides. "That's just storage," she said quickly. "Old linens, nothing more." Crawley's eyes narrowed. "Open it, Miss Vance," he said, his voice hard. Clara hesitated, then produced a second key from her pocket, her fingers trembling as she unlocked the door. It creaked open, revealing a small, damp room, its walls bare, save for a single lantern hanging from a hook. And there, seated on a wooden bench, was Eleanor Langley. She was disheveled, her ivory gown stained with dust, her dark hair loose and tangled. Her eyes, wide with relief, met Crawley's as she struggled to her feet. "Thank God," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "I thought no one would find me." Miss Marple's heart quickened, though her expression remained serene. "My dear," she said, stepping forward, "are you hurt?" Eleanor shook her head, her hands trembling as she clutched the bench. "No, just frightened. Beatrice, she brought me here. She said there was a surprise, something about the wedding. Then she locked the door and left me." Her voice broke, and she covered her face. "She said it was about the money, my inheritance. She thought if I was gone, she could claim it." Crawley's face hardened, his notebook forgotten as he turned to Clara. "You knew about this room, Miss Vance. Why didn't you mention it?" Clara's composure cracked, her voice rising. "I didn't know she was here. It's just storage, I swear it." But her eyes darted to the door, and Miss Marple noted the panic in them. Clara, she thought, knows more than she admits, but is it guilt or fear? The sergeant helped Eleanor to her feet, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders as they escorted her upstairs. Crawley turned to Miss Marple, his expression a mix of astonishment and respect. "You were right about the cellar, Miss Marple. That scratch, how did you know?" She smiled, her eyes twinkling. "In St. Mary Mead, Inspector, a scratched lock once led me to a hidden truth. People hide things in locked places, but they always leave a mark." She paused, her thoughts turning to Beatrice. "Miss Langley, the sister, will need to explain herself, I think." As they returned to the library, Eleanor was seated with a cup of tea, her face pale but composed. She recounted her story in halting words. Beatrice had lured her to the cellar with a promise of a wedding surprise, then locked her in the small room, speaking of the inheritance and her own desperate need. "She was so angry," Eleanor said, her voice trembling. "She said I'd always had everything, and she deserved her share." Miss Marple listened, her mind cataloging the details. The rouge, the hairpin, the pearl all pointed to Beatrice, and now Eleanor's testimony sealed her guilt. But Clara's role remained unclear, her key, her defensiveness, the scratch on the lock. Envy, Miss Marple thought, is a poison, but complicity is a shadow that lingers. The morning light streamed through the library windows, illuminating the weary faces of the investigators. Eleanor was safe, but the mystery was not fully resolved. Miss Marple, her knitting bag at her side, knew the truth was close, its threads now visible in the light of day. "Beatrice," she murmured, "has cast a long shadow, but there is more to uncover." She would watch and listen, and the truth would emerge, as it always did. Chapter 9. The Sisters' Confession. The Grand Aurora Hotel, bathed in the clear light of mid-morning, seemed to exhale a collective sigh of relief with Eleanor Langley's safe return. The ballroom, though still marked by the disarray of the previous night, was no longer a scene of despair. Staff moved quietly to restore order, their footsteps soft on the polished floors. The guests, released from their confinement, gathered in small knots in the lounge, their voices a murmur of astonishment and speculation. Eleanor, now in a fresh dress provided by the hotel, sat in the library, a shawl draped over her shoulders, her face pale but composed. Inspector Crawley, his fatigue tempered by the triumph of finding the bride, stood nearby, his notebook open as he prepared to confront the final piece of the puzzle. Beatrice Langley, Miss Jane Marple, her knitting bag at her side, occupied her usual corner of the library, her small figure almost lost in the high-backed chair. Her needles lay idle, her sharp eyes fixed on the door through which Beatrice would soon enter. The Clouste de Rouge stained veil, the silver hairpin, the pearl. The scratched lock had woven a net around Beatrice, and Eleanor's testimony had tightened its strands. Yet Miss Marple's mind, ever cautious, lingered on the edges of the mystery, probing for unseen threads. She recalled a case in St. Mary Mead, where a confession had revealed only half the truth, the other half hidden in the silence of an accomplice. Confessions, she thought, are like mirrors. They show what is offered, but not always what is true. Inspector Crawley, his mustache no longer twitching with irritation, but with purpose, sent his sergeant to fetch Beatrice. She entered the library with a measured step, her green gown replaced by a simple gray dress, its severity accentuating the pallor of her face. Her auburn hair was still neatly pinned, though one silver hairpin was missing, a detail Miss Marple noted with quiet satisfaction. Beatrice's eyes, dark and guarded, met Crawley's briefly before dropping to the floor, her hands clasped tightly before her. She sat without being asked, her posture rigid, as if bracing for a storm. "Miss Langley," Crawley began, his voice firm but not unkind. "Your sister has been found, locked in a hidden cellar room. She claims you lured her there, locked the door, and left her, intending to secure her inheritance. We have evidence, a hairpin, a smudge of rouge, your presence near the terrace that places you at the heart of this. I suggest you tell us the truth." Beatrice's lips parted, a faint gasp escaping, but she quickly regained her composure. "Eleanor's safe?" she asked, her voice trembling with what might have been relief or fear. "Thank God, I never meant for her to be hurt." "Then explain yourself," Crawley said, leaning forward. "Why was she locked in that room? Why lie about your movements?" Beatrice's hands tightened, her knuckles white against the gray fabric of her dress. For a moment, she was silent, her eyes fixed on a point beyond the inspector, as if seeing the events of the night unfold anew. Then, with a shudder that seemed to shake her entire frame, she began to speak, her voice low and halting. "It was the money," she said, her words barely above a whisper. "Eleanor's and father's fortune. It was always hers. You see, I was the younger sister, the one who got the scraps. She was the beauty, the favorite, the one who could do no wrong. When father died, he left everything to her land, investments, the house. I got a pittance, enough to live quietly, but not enough to live." Her voice cracked, and she paused, her eyes glistening. "I've spent my life in her shadow, always second, always less." Miss Marple listened, her expression kind but unwavering. She had seen such resentment before, in St. Mary Mead, where a sister's envy had led to a petty theft that spiraled into betrayal. Beatrice's words rang true, but there was a cadence to them, a rehearsed quality that suggested preparation. Envy, Miss Marple thought, is a fire that burns the heart, but it rarely acts alone. Beatrice continued, her voice steadier now. "When Eleanor announced her plan to give most of the inheritance to charity, I couldn't bear it. It was as if she was throwing away my future, too. I thought if she were gone, just for a little while, I could convince the solicitors to transfer the estate to me. I didn't want to hurt her, I swear. I just wanted her out of the way until the papers were signed." She looked up, her eyes pleading. "I lured her to the cellar with a story about a surprise gift. I locked her in that room. It was supposed to be temporary. I thought Charles would be blamed, that people would think he'd done something in a fit of jealousy over the money." Crawley's pen scratched furiously, his face a mask of concentration. "And the veil, the rouge, the hairpin." Beatrice hesitated, her fingers brushing her cheek, where the coral rouge had been. "I took the veil from her in the cellar. She didn't need it there. I left it on the terrace to make it look like she'd run off. The rouge, it must have smudged when I handled it. The hairpin, I didn't realize I'd lost it." Her voice faltered, and she looked down, her hands trembling. "I didn't think it would go this far." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly, though her expression remained gentle. "The confession was neat, almost too neat, tying together the clues with a precision that felt rehearsed. She thought of Clara Vance, her defensiveness about the cellar, the scratched lock, the second key. Had Beatrice acted alone, or was there another hand guiding her? Truth, Miss Marple thought, is like a garden, it needs tending to reveal what lies beneath. Crawley leaned back, his gaze piercing. You realize, Miss Langley, that this is a serious crime. Kidnapping, even with intent to release, is a matter for the courts. And if you're lying about any of this— I'm not lying, Beatrice said quickly, her voice rising. I did it alone. No one else knew. But her eyes darted toward the door, a fleeting glance that Miss Marple caught, her mind filing it away. A glance, she thought, is as telling as a word. The inspector nodded, though his expression suggested he was not fully convinced. We'll need to verify your story, Miss Langley. For now, you'll remain in custody. He signaled to his sergeant, who stepped forward to escort Beatrice from the room. She rose, her movements slow, her face a mask of resignation. As she passed Miss Marple, their eyes met, and for a moment, Beatrice's composure faltered, a flicker of fear or guilt crossing her features. Miss Marple's smile was kind, but her mind was racing. A confession, she thought, closes one door, but it opens another. As Beatrice was led away, Miss Marple approached Crawley, her shawl draped neatly over her arm. Inspector, she said, her voice soft but firm, you've done admirably to find Eleanor. But might I suggest a closer look at Miss Vance's role? The cellar's hidden room, the second key. She knew more than she admitted. I think. Crawley's brow furrowed, but he nodded. You're right, Miss Marple. There's something off about her story. We'll question her again. He paused, a rare smile tugging at his lips. You've a knack for this, I'll give you that. Ever thought of joining the force? Miss Marple chuckled, her eyes twinkling. Oh, Inspector, I'm far too old for that, but in St. Mary Mead, I've learned that human nature is the same everywhere, and it always leaves a trail. She returned to her seat, her thoughts turning to Clara, the wedding planner's precision. Her guarded demeanor, the scratched lock, were threads that did not yet align with Beatrice's confession. Had Clara known of the hidden room, or had she merely suspected? And why the second key? She made her way to the lounge, where Eleanor sat with Charles, their hands clasped tightly, their faces a mixture of relief and strain. Clara was nearby, directing the staff with a renewed vigor, as if to erase the night's chaos. Miss Marple watched her, noting the way her eyes flickered toward the corridor leading to the cellar. A woman like that, she thought, lives for control, but control slips when secrets are exposed. The morning light streamed through the windows, illuminating the hotel's grandeur, but Miss Marple's focus was on the shadows. Confession had unraveled much of the mystery, but Clara's silence was a puzzle yet to be solved. Truth, Miss Marple murmured, is never complete until all the pieces fit. She would watch and listen, and the final thread would emerge, as it always did. Chapter 10. The Resolution. The Grand Aurora Hotel, its elegance restored by the full light of noon, seemed to shake off the shadows of the previous night's turmoil. The ballroom, now tidied by the diligent staff, gleamed once more with polished floors and sparkling chandeliers, as if eager to reclaim its role as a place of celebration. The guests, though still shaken, had begun to disperse, their whispers of the night's events fading into murmurs of relief at Eleanor Langley's safe return. The terrace, where the crumpled veil had sparked such alarm, basked innocently in the sunlight, its rose bushes serene. Miss Jane Marple, her knitting bag tucked beside her, sat in the lounge near a window, her small figure bathed in warmth. Her eyes, sharp and serene behind her spectacles, surveyed the scene with quiet satisfaction, though her mind lingered on the final threads of the mystery. Inspector Crawley, his fatigue, now tempered by the resolution of the case, had moved his operations to a smaller office off the ballroom, where he finalized his reports. Beatrice Langley's confession had closed the net around her. Her envy-driven scheme to secure Eleanor's inheritance laid bare. Yet Miss Marple, ever cautious, sensed a lingering shadow. Clara Vance's role remained unresolved, her defensiveness about the cellar and the scratched lock suggesting a deeper involvement. The old lady's experience in St. Mary Mead had taught her that confessions, while illuminating, often left questions unanswered, like a tapestry with a frayed edge in the library. Eleanor sat with Charles Haverford, their hands entwined, their faces reflecting a fragile reconciliation. The argument over her inheritance, which had cast a shadow over their engagement, seemed forgotten in the wake of her ordeal. Charles's eyes, once strained with worry, now held a quiet devotion, though Miss Marple noted the way his fingers tightened around Eleanor's, as if anchoring himself against lingering doubts. Love, she thought, is a sturdy thread, but it frays under strain. Inspector Crawley summoned Clara Vance for a final interview, and Miss Marple, permitted to linger as a concerned observer, settled into her corner, her knitting untouched. Clara entered, her severe bun and tailored dress as impeccable as ever, but her eyes betrayed a flicker of unease. The absence of her clipboard, that emblem of her control, was telling, and Miss Marple noted the slight tremor in her hands as she sat across from the inspector. "Miss Vance," Crawley began, his voice steady but probing. "Miss Langley, Beatrice has confessed to locking her sister in the cellar. But the hidden room, the second key, the scratched lock, you knew more than you let on. I need the truth." Clara's lips tightened, her posture rigid. "I've told you everything, Inspector," she said, her voice clipped. "The cellar is for wine. The hidden room is old storage linens, nothing more. I didn't know Miss Langley was there." Her fingers brushed her sleeve, a nervous gesture that Miss Marple had come to recognize. Crawley leaned forward, his mustache still. "The lock on that room was scratched, just like the main cellar door, and you had the key. If you're protecting someone, or yourself, knows the time to speak." Clara's eyes darted to the door, then back to Crawley. For a moment, she seemed poised to deflect, but then her shoulders sagged, a rare crack in her composure. "I didn't know about Eleanor," she said, her voice low, "but I suspected Beatrice was up to something. She asked about the cellar weeks ago, during the planning. She wanted to know about storage spaces, hidden areas. I thought she was just curious. Some brides want surprises for their guests. I showed her the old room, thinking nothing of it." She paused, her hands clenching. "Last night, after the scream, I saw her near the cellar door, looking panicked. I checked the lock later, it was scratched, and I worried she'd done something foolish. But I didn't know she'd locked Eleanor there." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly, though her expression remained kind. Clara's story was plausible, but its timing felt convenient, like a seam stitched too quickly. She recalled a case in St. Mary Mead, where a housekeeper's half-truth about a locked cupboard had concealed her complicity in a theft. Knowledge, Miss Marple thought, is as dangerous as action, if it's hidden. Crawley's pen scratched across his notebook. "Why didn't you tell us this last night, Miss Vance? You obstructed the investigation." Clara's cheeks flushed, but she held his gaze. "I was protecting the hotel's reputation. A scandal like this, guests locked in cellars, it could ruin us. I thought Beatrice would come forward, that it was a prank gone wrong. I didn't realize the extent of it until you found her." Her voice wavered, and Miss Marple noted the strain, a mix of guilt and fear. The inspector nodded, though his eyes suggested he was not fully satisfied. "You'll need to make a formal statement, Miss Vance, and if there's more you're not telling, it'll come out." Clara rose, her movements stiff, and left the room, her head held high but her eyes shadowed. Miss Marple watched her go, her mind cataloging the confession. Clara's role was peripheral, but her silence had enabled Beatrice's scheme, a sin of omission rather than commission. Silence, Miss Marple thought, is a choice, and choices reveal character. With Beatrice in custody and Eleanor safe, the investigation wound down. Crawley approached Miss Marple, his expression a mix of respect and exasperation. "You've been a help, Miss Marple," he said, tucking his notebook away. "That cellar? Business. Your hunch about the lock was spot on. How do you do it?" Miss Marple smiled, her eyes twinkling. "In St. Mary Mead, Inspector, people are much the same as here. They love, they envy, they hide. You only need to watch and listen, and the truth comes clear." She paused, her tone gentle. "Human nature is a universal language, you see." The wedding, though delayed, resumed in a quieter form, a small ceremony in the hotel's chapel. Eleanor, radiant despite her ordeal, stood with Charles, their vows a testament to their renewed bond. Roger Thornton, chastened by the night's events, admitted to Crawley that his debts had led him to flirt with Eleanor, hoping to charm his way into her favor, but he swore he had no part in her disappearance. His confession, though embarrassing, cleared him of suspicion, and Miss Marple noted his subdued demeanor with a nod. Charm, she thought, fades when truth shines through. Clara, her role clarified, apologized to Eleanor for her silence, citing her fear for the hotel's reputation. Eleanor, ever gracious, forgave her, though Miss Marple sensed a lingering wariness in her eyes. The guests, now free to leave, offered their congratulations, their earlier fears replaced by relief. Miss Marple, invited to the ceremony as an honored guest, sat in a pew, her knitting resumed, its steady rhythm a counterpoint to her thoughts, as the couple exchanged rings. Miss Marple reflected on the fragility of trust and the weight of envy. Beatrice's actions, driven by a lifetime of resentment, had nearly shattered her sister's happiness, while Clara's silence had prolonged the ordeal. People, she thought, are their own worst enemies, but they also carry the seeds of redemption. She glanced at Eleanor, whose smile held a quiet strength, and Charles, whose devotion seemed renewed. The mystery was solved, the truth laid bare, and Miss Marple felt the quiet satisfaction of a puzzle completed as she sipped tea at the reception. A modest affair compared to the previous night. She overheard Crawley speaking to a constable. "That Miss Marple," he said, shaking his head. "She's sharper than half my men. Sees things we miss." Miss Marple smiled to herself, her needles clicking softly. "Truth," she murmured, "is always there, waiting to be seen. You only need to look." The sun streamed through the chapel windows, casting a warm glow over the gathered guests. The Grand Aurora Hotel, its grandeur restored, stood as a backdrop to a new beginning. Miss Marple, her work done, gathered her shawl and prepared to leave, her thoughts already turning to the quiet of St. Mary Mead. But she knew, wherever she went, human nature would follow, and with it, the mysteries only she could unravel.